One chapter of your book is called Tell Me What You Know. And you write about rules that you developed for your intelligence staffs. And the 4 rules are: 1, tell me what you know; 2, tell me what you don't know; 3, then tell me what you think; and 4, always distinguish which from which.
Yeah.
This brings us to Iraq.
Yeah.
And I guess my big question is, in huge capital letters, how? But specifically, someone whom we identify with caution and the use of military force, never going in light, weighing our obligations very carefully, being very much the realist in foreign policy. Tell me about the decision that was made to go to war in Iraq, how you figured in it, and your presentation to the UN.
In the first year of President Bush's administration, George W. Bush, Iraq was an issue. Remember, we had planes flying over the north and southern portion of Iraq, and then the Iraqis were shooting at them. But for the most part, they were contained. But the sanctions regime was starting to break down. And we were watching it very carefully to see whether or not we could allow the sanctions regime to break down, the UN sanctions, and Iraq is free to do whatever it wants to, oppress its people more, or build weapons of mass destruction again. Remember, they had them in the first Gulf War. Remember that they used them against their own people, to kill some 5,000 Iraqis. They fired them against the Iranians. So it's not a figment of our imagination that these people don't have the ability to do it, and we thought they had them.
They used chemical weapons.
Chemical weapons, but they also were playing with nuclear programs that weren't that far along, and we had a pretty good idea that they were playing with biological weapons as well, which are much more difficult to use, but nevertheless, they're deadly. And then along comes 9/11, and the president is faced with the challenge of, bringing the country together and fighting this conflict that we are now in, brought to us from Afghanistan by Al-Qaeda. And so we go to Afghanistan correctly, and we get that, what seems to be under control at the time. Did a terrific job, although it didn't stay under control. And then the president's attention turned toward Iraq, because his concern, a legitimate concern, the one provided by the intelligence community, was there could be a nexus between the weapons of mass destruction that Iraq has or could develop and terrorism. And so the president started to ask his military authorities to give him plans for such a contingency, which they do. In August of 2002, I sense that the president is receiving a lot of military information, but we really haven't put it into a broader political context. So I came back from a trip and I asked to see him. And I went up and had dinner with the president, and Condi Rice was there. And then after dinner, we went into his private study, and I said, Mr. President, you need to understand that if we have to use military force and take out this regime, we become the government of this country. It's international law. If you take out a regime, and there are 25, 27 million people standing there, you're in charge. So if you break it, you own it, was the expression I used. And we talked about it for a while, what that meant, what it could, the implications could be. And he said, what do you think we ought to do? And I said, Mr. President, I think we ought to try to avoid the war, and let's go to the UN. They're the offended party. And see if we can get the UN to act and get a resolution that will put the inspectors back in and see if Saddam really wants to play by the rules and turn over everything he has and give us all the information we know he has. The President agreed. And in September of 2002, he went before the UN, September 12th, and made the case for the UN to get engaged, send inspectors back, and pass necessary resolutions. I worked on the resolution draft for 7 weeks, and we got a resolution in early November from the UN putting Saddam on notice and also demanding that he turn in all the information and the weapons that he had. Well, he flunked that test. And I also made it clear to the president that if he passed the test, you might still be stuck with Saddam Hussein and Powell, but he won't have weapons of mass destruction. The president understood that. I also made it clear to him that if it was necessary to use military force, I would be fully supportive, because you tried. You tried to avoid the war. And then to speed this up, in late January, the president, none of us were satisfied with the response or what the UN had been able to fully uncover. And so by the middle of January, the president had decided that force would be necessary. And at the end of January, I was with him, and he said, we need to present our case to the United Nations, to the world, and I'd like you to do it. I said, by all means. And do it next week. So I had 4 days from the time he told me to the time that I had to make the presentation. I wasn't concerned because the case was being worked on by the National Security Council, is what we all thought. At least most of us thought. And then when I saw the case that had been working on, it wasn't what we needed. It didn't connect up to the intelligence. It didn't cross-reference things. So I asked the Director of Central Intelligence, well, how did it get like this? And he said, we didn't have anything to do with it. We provided all the information to the NSC, and they took it from there. So I was concerned. I couldn't get any change in time because the President had already announced that I would be there on the 5th of February. I wasn't worried because there was a national intelligence estimate asked for by the Congress that had gone to the Congress the previous fall. And based on that national intelligence estimate, the Congress had overwhelmingly passed a joint resolution saying to the President, try to solve this diplomatically, but if you can't, we will support you going to war. So almost 4 months before I was going to go to the UN, Congress had already said to the President, if you have to do this, we'll support you. And it was not a close vote. It was rather overwhelming. And so anyway, I knew I could pull it all together from the National Intelligence Estimate. I went out to CIA and lived there 4 days and then 4 nights with my staff, pulling it all together, with the Director of Central Intelligence and with the combined wisdom of 16 intelligence communities that came together for the NIE. And so we pulled it all together, and I tossed a lot of it aside because there weren't enough sources for it. And the things that were in the presentation, I was assured, were very, very well sourced, and they could stand behind it. And so went up to New York, brought charts and other slides with me, and had a presentation that had been vetted by the CIA. Every word was attached to and bought by the CIA. With the intelligence the President had, he'd been using it. My colleagues in government and the administration had been using it. The British were using it. And so that's what I presented and thought it went off rather well. And the British and the Spanish foreign ministers joined in agreeing, and others, such as the French and Russians and others, were not in agreement. But that's where we were. And then about a month later, the President decided to launch the military action. And then within a few weeks, we discovered, hey, nobody's found anything over there. We can't find anything. And then over time, it started to emerge a little bit at a time that some of the sourcing that we had been assured of, Congress acted on, the President acted on, we all acted on, some of the sourcing was not reliable. And I was taken aback when I thought there were 4 sources for the radiological or the bacteriological vans, only to discover it was a single source and we'd never met him. The Germans had him, and we'd been getting information from the Germans, and we'd never talked to this guy. Curveball is his famous name. And so the case of the presence of weapons of mass destruction started to fall apart completely. We still felt he had the capability to develop them, and if left free of sanctions, he would develop them. We knew he was still interested in nuclear weapons and everything imaginable that would be bad. But the thing we presented that said they were there turned out not to be the case. Now, a lot of people agreed with the case and bought into it. The CIA stuck by it. 6 months later, the CIA said, we still support the judgments we made last year. And so the problem that I've had for the last 9 years is that, notwithstanding all of that, my presentation is seen as the defining one, the most prominent one, and became the symbol of the whole intelligence package that we put together. And I've been answering questions about it. But all I can say is I'm glad Saddam Hussein is gone. I'm glad we don't have to worry about weapons of mass destruction being present or not present. And I'm glad that human rights violations have ended. The country is still not completely through the transition, but we've given them an opportunity for a better life for their people. And I will always regret that the information that I presented was not wrong. But I get offended when people say, well, you all knew better. You all knew this was a lie. No, we accepted the considered judgment, the analytical judgment of the Director of Central Intelligence and all the 16 intelligence agencies that feed into him. but I'm still seen as the symbol of it all. And that's just something I have to work with. And I've discussed this in the book, and I said I'll never get rid of that. It'll be in my obituary. And so I have to keep moving forward.
Well, you actually, unlike anyone else involved in this, I believe, you apologized, actually, for giving a misleading...
No, I said I regretted it. I regretted it, yeah. I regretted that the information was wrong. I didn't apologize for it because I wasn't the source of it.
But if in fact, as you told President Bush, if Saddam Hussein gives up his weapons of mass destruction, that would mean he would remain in power. He'd be in compliance with what we're demanding.
That's right.
In reality, he didn't have any weapons of mass destruction. He was in compliance.
Yes. He chose not to take the get-out-of-jail card. We gave him an opportunity, but he didn't want us to know that he didn't have them, and he didn't want his own people to know he didn't have them. He really thought we would not attack. That somebody would stop us, the French, the Germans, the Russians, somebody would keep it from happening. And President Bush was determined that we had to remove him and this potential threat and also provide a better life for the Iraqi people. Still controversial for this day, but that's the story.
Did you feel strongly that the U.S. was sending too few troops to Iraq to occupy the country?
You didn't know what was going to happen once Baghdad fell. There was no question in my mind that the capture of Baghdad would be easy. First Gulf War had brought the Iraqi army down in size considerably. And so I had no question about that. But as we developed the plans, I was concerned that perhaps maybe not enough force was going in anticipation of what else might be a problem once we got there. And so I called General Franks, who's the commander, and I said, Tommy, Colin, I don't want to get in your business, but are you sure you have enough troops to deal with this? And I don't know what this is. That's the interesting thing about war. You don't know really what's going to happen after you have achieved that initial objective. And he was satisfied. I presume the Joint Chiefs were satisfied, and Secretary Rumsfeld was satisfied. And these are the military authorities, and they persuaded the president. Baghdad fell quickly. And what surprised me is that as soon as Baghdad fell, you could almost see within a week or so that ministries are being burned down, old animosities that Saddam Hussein had kept suppressed have popped up between Shia and Sunni and Kurds, and then the bombing started. And my colleagues dismissed all of this as sort of, well, these are just dead enders, as one of my colleagues described them. And it seemed to me they were not dead enders. While this was emerging, we were sending troops home. And we had stopped the flow of the additional troops that were supposed to come because we expected some sort of Iraqi government to sort of spring into place rather quickly and that there would be no need for these large number of troops. Some of you may remember when General Shinseki, then the Chief of Staff of the Army, now Secretary of Veterans Department, but he was asked at a hearing, well, how many troops do you think it will take, General? And he said, a couple of 100,000. And he was immediately criticized by the leadership of the Department of Defense the next day as saying it can't be right. We don't agree with the general. This is a general who lost a leg in Vietnam, who's been around for about 30-odd years, who was involved in the Balkans. He knows a little bit about all of this, but his judgment was immediately dismissed because we didn't expect that to happen. Well, the things that you don't expect to happen are the things you plan for and be ready for when they do happen.